Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and this lecture will prepare you so that you'll be ready to go when you read these books. So first, looking at 1st Thessalonians, this was another letter written by the Apostle Paul, and the date is somewhere around 51 CE. So remember back in the Galatians lecture that it is most likely the first letter. If it's not the first letter, then 1st Thessalonians most likely is. So these were right around the same time. Paul is writing to the church in Thessalonica, and this is a newly established church. Paul actually established it on his second missionary journey. So it's a new church filled with mostly young believers. And Thessalonica was a port city in modern-day Greece. So a city there on the coast. So the key themes of 1 Thessalonians, first is a call to persevere. So the church was suffering from intense persecution, and as a result, what Paul stresses throughout 1 Thessalonians and in the second is that one of the ways that you can, or basically the primary way that he suggests that you can get through this persecution is to hold on to hope, and that is hope that Jesus Christ will return. And so it's ultimately hope that is grounded in Jesus' authority in his second coming, that in his second coming he will make himself known as the King of the world, and everything that is wrong will be made right. And so this theme is prevalent in all of the chapters in the letter of 1 Thessalonians. And then the last key theme is love for fellow believers. So Paul basically commends them for how they have been loving each other well, but then also encourages them to continue to love each other. So as with all of the letters, it's important to situate the letter you're reading within the backdrop of Acts and the history that the book of Acts gives. So Paul, Silas, and Timothy came to Thessalonica around 51 CE after establishing the church in Philippi. And I have all the references here in Acts, so you can go back and kind of read this history. So Paul was preaching there until some unbelieving Jews, some Jews that did not believe that Jesus was Messiah, they come in and they run Paul out. They are not happy that Paul is there preaching. So Paul goes on to Berea, but the Jewish opponents of Thessalonica actually follow him there and force him to leave once again. So Paul is not in Thessalonica for very long, quickly establishes this church and it's flourishing, but he is forced to head on out to Athens. But he cares about the church and he wants to know how it's doing. And so he sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to check on the church. And so Timothy reports back to Paul with his findings, and then Paul writes this letter as a result. So there's just the brief history that leads to Paul writing this letter. The structure of 1 Thessalonians, it's a pretty short book. It makes up 5 chapters. Chapters 1 through 3 are focused on Paul's relationship with the Thessalonians and his ministry there. So he's talking about him coming and establishing the church there and his love for them, and it's a very positive, joyous tone. And then in chapters 4 and 5, Paul gives instructions on godly living and Christ's return. So he gives all these instructions, and they're filled with hope. As these people are enduring persecution, he wants them to be hopeful in how they will be sanctified through the Spirit. So remember the role of the Spirit in the letter to the Galatians. This is similar, that he's talking about how as one lives with the Spirit inside them, they will be more sanctified to look more like Jesus. And then he also, in 1 Thessalonians, includes the pretty well-known verse to live quietly and mind your own affairs. So he's basically just calling them to live faithfully to the gospel that has been proclaimed, and just to be diligent stewards of the gospel. And then he also talks about those who have died and will rise again. And this is referring to those that have died as a result of the persecution. And so he encourages them to look forward to the day of the Lord and refers them back to the second coming of Jesus, when all the bad things will diminish in light of Jesus's great return. Okay, so moving on to 2 Thessalonians. This is the second letter that Paul wrote to this church in a short period of time. So it seems like he got the report back from Timothy and wrote the first letter, and then not long after that hears about a new problem that had sprung up in the church, and so he writes them this additional letter. The key themes, there are 3 key themes. The first is a call to maturity. So he's encouraging them to continue to endure in persecution and continue to be faithful to the gospel. The second is that he corrects misconceptions about the day of the Lord. So these 2 letters alone, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, contain the most teaching on eschatology. And eschatology is the doctrine of the end times. It's thinking about the return of Jesus and kind of the wrapping up of this salvific plan and what happens when Jesus returns. And so he's correcting some mistaken views that the church at Thessalonians had about when Jesus returns. And then finally, he touches a lot on accountability. So he talks a lot about how they should refrain from idleness and from not wanting to work, and how they should continue to be faithful in their pursuit of Jesus and just being good workers for the gospel in general. So the reason for writing, shortly after writing the first letter, Paul hears that some in the Thessalonian church had come to believe that the day of the Lord had already begun. So they were thinking that that present time was part of God's final judgment. And so basically they were thinking that Jesus was going to return any day. And as a result, they had pretty much just stopped working. They were just idle. And basically they were thinking, okay, the end of the world is here, Jesus is coming back, so what's the point in spending our last few days working? And so this is what Paul basically writes to refute, is to encourage them to continue on and to not refuse to work. And then finally the structure. So 2 Thessalonians is short. Chapter 1, he commends the church for their faithfulness and for their commitment to the gospel. And then in chapter 2, he corrects their mistaken theology about the day of the Lord and about Jesus' second return. He then in chapter 3 clarifies how they should live while waiting. So he is calling them to not be lazy or idle, but to continue to spread the good news of Jesus and to continue to be faithful in the work that they've been given to do. And this wraps up 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.